And we're going to be talking about the financial development and economic growth. We have three nice presentations. Our first speaker will be Vadym Volosovych from Erasmus University, and he will be talking about identifying knowledge spillovers and competition effects. Vadym, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in Kyiv, and thanks organizer for including our paper into the program. And well, overall the organization and the level of logistics was excellent. So I thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to have the. So. The paper I want to present today is a joint work with a number of co-authors. It's almost a research lab. It's my colleagues from University of Pampa-Fabra, Maryland, Houston, and ESADE. And we are going to talk about something which we touched upon yesterday, somewhat related issues to industrial policy. So what can be done to make sure that the foreign investment into Ukraine has the largest spillovers or positive effects or negative, positive, hopefully, effects on productivity of the firms who remain in domestic ownership. So not the ones who are being taken over by the foreigners, but who remain, for instance, Ukrainian, when there is an entry or presence of foreign owners in the particular sectors of the domestic economy. So basically, we know in theory the companies who are multinationals are most productive because they do things correctly, so they're able to spread out globally in other countries and offer products and services and distribution networks which are superior to purely domestic companies on average. So this is the theoretical result which was advanced in the mid-2000s pretty convincingly. So again, our topic is what happens to non-acquired firms upon entry of these multinationals into the economy. And the relevant policy question, so, well, basically, should we promote this foreign presence, right? So, for instance, there is this major agri firm who is the largest agricultural and processing company by revenue in the United States, private owned. And it's present in my hometown of Dnipropetrovsk in the region from early 90s, pretty much after the collapse of Soviet Union. And since then, they expanded a lot by building the processing plants from scratch or acquiring a number of industries. And we can ask, okay, so what happens to, well, the home grain producers or processors, well, during the 90s there emerged this so-called Washington Consensus, right? So a set of prescriptions to the developing countries with respect to the FDI and foreign investment, which says unambiguously this is a good thing to have, right? So the presence of this. So, well, we could ask more specific, so what happens to these Ukrainian non-acquired firms who somehow are related to Cargill, right? Do we need to support this entry of companies? Do we need to support those domestic firms, or do we let markets figure out? So, and well, empirical macro literature looking at the firm level data looks, yes, so we establish correlations, positive correlations between some measure of foreign ownership or foreign direct investment in economic growth. Theoretical models agree, so we need the continuous technological advances to promote long-term economic growth, right? So the policy push emerging again. So yes, we need to bring foreign technology, know-how, and this will help to achieve this sustainable long-term economic growth, which we discussed yesterday. So typically we establish this macroeconomic specification by this sort of linear regression, so FDI, growth, but of course there are several challenges, econometric challenges with this, so it could be something which we want to establish. So FDI economically causes growth, but it could be reverse causality, so for countries who grow fast and generate higher return to investors, attract those investors, because investors chase return adjusted for risk. Or it could be some third factor which we don't include in the specification. For example, institutional quality, which promotes both growth. But if we don't account for these factors, so we omit the variable which biases estimates. So what needs to be done is we need to provide and test this hypothesis in a more granular data. So this is the trend in this literature which for some time, right? So in kind of the literature moved for more and more detailed data as, of course, this data became available. So what do we learn from firm level data? So to make it very concrete and understandable, let's look at this example. So this is the existing relationship between the industries. So manufacturer of basic metals is a supplier of inputs to the sector manufacturer of motor vehicles. So think about aluminum suppliers to the bodies of cars, right? So basically what literature does, so in language of this particular literature, there is this horizontal or vertical FDI spillovers, right? So horizontal spillovers are measured is roughly the presence of foreign companies within the sector, like this or that. And we say, okay, so if there is a larger foreign presence, so spillovers or effects of foreign ownership into domestic firms is larger, proportionally larger, whatever effect it is, right? So vertical FDI spillover says, okay, so we need to trace the relationships between input-output, which are given by these input-output tables, right? So we need to see, for example, if there is a foreign ownership in motor vehicle production, so what happens to the suppliers of metals or tires, right? So who are domestic. So this is the sort of framework as it was, and basically the question is, so what is the evidence of productivity of foreign to domestic firms using firm level data? And well, basically the partial motivation is a very mixed result in terms of spillovers within the sectors. So depending on your country, is it UK, US, is it emerging markets, so results could be positive on average or negative on firm or domestic firm productivity. So this created another extension of this literature, so into searching for any evidence of kind of positive spillovers, tracing this input-output relationship between sectors. So-called vertical FDI spillovers were established overwhelmingly as positive. So, and we basically, what we try to see is whether or not we can do better in terms of searching these horizontal spillovers within the broad sectors like these. Right? So this is the topic. And the argument we make is, well, it's important to recognize that so far the literature only looked at very broad classification of the sector. So our search for accounting and recognizing heterogeneity didn't go far enough to establish what we tried to find. So we revisit this issue of finding horizontal spillovers in two-digit industry, and we try to address these limitations of the studies, and we try to separate empirically the knowledge spillovers, learning, so emerging from cooperation between companies in terms of some research and development and imitation of best technique and so on, from what is happening in the product markets, which is interpreted as product market rivalry or competition effects and things of that nature. So, and of course, if you focus on only one country, we also have some problem because, for instance, if there is a global industry shock, for instance, for some reason, foreign investors want to buy out IT sector in the whole Eastern European region across the board, because they know that, you know, we have a good programmers on average, right? So this is not a country issue. So this is just a global industry shock. So we need to combine several countries. So that's what we do. So again, so this is what we contribute, we believe, right? So let me give again very concrete example. Firm from our sample, a French producer of very specialized steel tubing for nuclear power plants, right? So Volosovych nuclear. They are classified by the literature, our literature, in a very broad sample manufacturing of basic metals. But you see already this is a problem because it's not a basic metal, it's a very specialized product. So which is more precisely specialized manufacturing of tubes, pipes, and of steel. Okay, so this is what we do in our paper. And well, basically, if you look at the data, this firm actually enjoyed quite huge increase in productivity over a period of 8 years. So what we do is we break down the effect of multinational on TFP of Volosovych, so firms like that, in the same 4-digit sector, right? So what happens if there are some foreign firms operating in the same tube production in France, but they are foreign owned. So what happens to productivity of this French producer? Or if the companies who are not necessarily in this sector, but in a sector like that, so more broad sector, so are they affecting the company? So they are not direct in the production of tubes, pipes made of steel, but they are in this large sector 24. So this is what we try to identify. So, and in particular, we are measuring whether or not the companies who are not direct product market competitors, perhaps, are related in what we call technology space. Right? So are they share some technological linkages, not necessarily product linkages. So to continue to build up, so let's look at, well, indeed, so we find in France the fully owned German subsidiary, Salzgitter Mannesmann, Precision, S&P. So they are daughter of Salzgitter AG of Germany, right? So they operate in this very narrow sector. They also make these things, these pipes. And they potentially could compete for the same contracts as Volosovych. So then we say that there is a potentially negative market competition effects in the final product. But they could well learn from each other, right, how to make those precision pipes in the best possible way. And that's what we call horizontal, within the same narrow 4-digit sector, learning or knowledge spillover effects. Moreover, there is a Dutch company, Constellium Montreux, fully owned Dutch subsidiary, which is operating in aluminum production. So notice the first 2 digits of this number is 24. So it's also manufacturing of basic metals, but it's a completely different thing. And we look and we couldn't find an input-output relationship. Producers of aluminum, they don't supply things to producers of steel. They don't compete, right? They are different products. But the existing literature would treat the Constellium and Volosovych as similar companies, because it's very unprecise classification, right? But if you're engineer, right, so you would know that aluminum and steel share some features in processing and melding and bonding, right? And if you look at the patents registered by firms in these 2 sectors, they share almost 30% of patenting. So they share important technology features between each other. So this is what we try to exploit and to see whether or not there is a vertical knowledge spillovers based on this technological interaction between these companies. So we're equipped with very detailed data on millions of firms in Europe, but we limit ourselves to some countries which report necessary data, larger companies. we use the firm-level patent data to identify this and input-output relationships. And basically, this is the measures we use. So horizontal spillovers is nothing more than weighted average by output, foreign ownership in a sector, country. So this is very standard measure, right? Input-output relationship, we multiply by the coefficient who says, okay, so sector which is different from sector of your own, right? So provides inputs to you to say 30%, right? And it's 0.3 times this. So this is weighted average by, this is also present in literature. We only do it at the 4-digit level. So this is the, to measure the relationship in input-output area. And then what we do, we use some result from Bloom and all, and we capture the sectoral technological closeness. So not product relationship, but technology closeness. So again, so we weight the presence of foreign ownership in the sectors by how close they are technologically, right? So also within your own sector, so S4, so very narrow sector, or the sectors who are somewhat broader, so within the sector 24, but not your own 24, 42, very narrow sector, right? So closely, so we try to see. So this is, I don't have time to, of course, so what this weight captures, it captures sectoral technological closeness based on common patenting, right? But also economic weight of these sectors. So this is the first result. So this is what happens within your own narrow 4-digit sector, right? So we run specification with revenue, total factor productivity. In a sample of, again, purely domestic firms, right? No foreign ownership at all in the whole history, based on these measures of foreign presence and adjusted, foreign presence adjusted for technological closeness. So this is the very standard result in the literature, so weak negative relationship if we just control for firm and country year fixed effect. If we add this possible selection or addressing of certain sector and years, in the column 2, we see the effect, horizontal effect in product space increases, so very negative relationship. So, and the coefficients are standardized, so they're divided by standard errors of these variables, so you can directly compare the magnitude of the effects. So you see it's important to account possible foreigners addressing certain sectors. And basically, if we control in column 4 both measure foreign presence in your sector and foreign presence adjusted for closeness in technology, we see why literature cannot establish very strong relationship, and it's very mixed results. So because there are two very strong opposing effects, right? So if there is a foreign presence in your own sector, you are hurt in terms of productivity, as the coefficient in first row shows, right? So because your productivity would, on average, go down, right? So this is identified from time variation. Firm fixed effects are just removed. So non-time varying differences between firms are removed. But if there are direct product competitors who also close to you technologically, right? So you can learn from them. So you can not only be hurt by your potential competitors, but you can also learn from them, right? So that's the second role. So that's why this is first important result. And then basically we look beyond very narrow 4-digit sector to what happens to your 2-digit sector. And we add up 4 potential channels. So the ones you saw before on the 3rd and 4th line, but these ones are foreign presence in your slightly larger 2-digit sector, but outside of your narrow 4-digit sector. So they are not direct competitors, but if we try to adjust for technological closeness, right? So we see that it's very positive effect on your productivity as well as from your competitors as before. There is this horizontal competitive or product rivalry effect, which turns out to be negative, as most of the studies find. But we see that on average, if you look at this sum of these coefficients, then the effect is positive. So that's the, I guess, key message today. And well, let me almost conclude. So amount of knowledge spillovers from FDI depends not just how much foreign investors are present in a particular sector, but in what firm they invest. Are they the firms who are close to you technologically, not necessarily similar to you in the product space? So productivity improving effect of FDI for local firms will depend on interaction between high FDI into high technologically sectors, but also close to you in terms of, you know, this know-how and technology. So, and basically these effects take time to materialize. So if you look at the very longer term 4-year differences, then effects increase, right? So you don't see much in the nearest future, so it takes time to materialize for these effects, these differences of TFP over a longer period of time. And of course, let me remind that we look at the revenue productivity. So this is what we really want to measure, physical productivity adjusted for price. Unfortunately, we don't have the data for producer's price, right? So we have to improvise or exploit some results in the literature so we can look, this is our main variable, but what we really care is the real productivity, right? So, but we cannot remove effect of firm prices, unfortunately, we don't absorb. But we can decompose it into markup over marginal cost and then this revenue productivity. Then there is this influential paper who teaches us how to estimate this markup, and we use some other results with assumptions we can decompose into the this channel. So this you saw before, revenue productivity. This is what happens to markups. So price. The profits in a sense, right? So you see again, so presence of domestic competitors hurt your bottom line, but well, if you learn from some less related but technologically close firms, it's good for your profits, right? So marginal costs are affected the oppositely. Of course, your marginal cost increases if there is the direct competitors, but if you learn from your direct competitors, as in the second line, or indirectly technologically related firms, it improves your marginal cost. And this is a sort of decomposition of revenue productivity when we remove effect of markups and proxy of marginal cost. So this is what happens to revenue productivity. This is same result states. So and the final table before I conclude. So let's look at very tangible evidence. So what do firms actually do, right? So this is the outcome here is not a productivity, but number of patents for the firms who do patent. And well, if they don't, we take a 0, of course, right? So we see that if companies learn, they also tend to patent more, right? Subsequently. And the competition, rivalry, presence in foreign ownership could be interpreted as, again, a rivalry. It hurts your R&D activity and patenting. Some robustness. So this is, we try to come up with the magnitude effects, right, of this. So experiment is, okay, so let's increase across the board the foreign ownership of the companies by 10%, small increase, right? So, and given our estimates in a preferred specification, we see 0.10% increase of productivity over long term, right? Which is, given the distribution of productivity, is sizable effect. And it can be decomposed into these channels on column 2, 3, 4, as well, positive learning effects in column 3 and 4. So it increases productivity by 0.15, 0.16%, but also, well, competitive pressure hurts your productivity. So these are meaningful effects. So what we did is we tried to identify the knowledge spillover which was not found in the literature in very broad sectors by digging deeper into this and accounting how firms are related. Whether or not they are related not only in product space as people would do, but also technologically. And we find that there are significant effects on productivity of domestic firms as a result of MNC presence in a broad two-digit sector. And well, so if we were to talk about the benefits onto the host domestic economy from foreign investment, we need to see where does this investors go, right? So how firms who remain domestic are related to those foreign multinationals. So that's the message for today. Thank you.
We have time for questions, so yes, please.
Maybe the microphone.
Thank you. Ivan Beletsky, postgraduate of Finance Department of Kyiv National Economic University after Vadym Hetman. Thank you for your fundamental economic report and presentation. My question, what are the challenges and problems of the development of human capital do you view today in the world in general and in Ukraine in particular? Thank you.
Well, of course, we know, we all know, and well, we had a policy panel yesterday about what can be done in terms of maybe industrial policy. So the message was that probably direct support, well, it's questionable, but what we can do is to indeed capitalize on the endowment of human capital and resources. And I was, for instance, spoke in National University of Taras Shevchenko yesterday, and I was very happy to see, first of all, attendance and interest of students and the fact that they could follow the English language presentation, right? So this means that they hope. And it's clear that a lot of, say, Ukrainian programmers are very sought after by a variety of Western companies. And we have a highly technologically advanced industries which we inherited from the Soviet times. And well, the thing is, how do we preserve that, right? So, and how do we capitalize that? So how do we, well, make sure that the right investment according to our project comes, and well, this capital, human capital, is exploited in the best possible way. But in terms of our paper, well, basically, given that you have this endowment, or given the technological activities of Ukrainian producers, you can enhance them by cooperating with multinationals who have this similar human capital. And of course, if you cooperate, if you go to international conferences, if our researchers are exposed to global network, including conferences like these, right? So then it will maintain your human capital. So we need to organize more colloquia, and we need to encourage our engineers to learn English as well.
Another questions here.
Sashko Talovera, Swansea University. Thank you very much for interesting talk. It brought me back to 2000, kind of my MSc dissertation at Kyiv School of Economics. Okay, very simple, short question, more like comment. If you talk about FDI, we have to think about not only the size of FDI flows, but also country of origin of FDI. It's like Cyprus or British Virgin Islands, you know, like the main supply of FDI. Mauritius is the main supplier for India. Well, but it depends on data availability. Is there any chance to track this in your data set, country of origin?
Yes, so we, in the data, we do know the source, the country of origin. We know even name, and we know type of the and in the other paper, which actually where we look at the direct effect on acquired firm, we exploit these differences between firms to be financial types or, say, industrial types, or, well, there is a known findings for even that source of foreign direct investment matters on how your daughter company will be organized. Organization of firms work by similar author aside, Bloom and others. So they found that, surprise, surprise, American daughter company is globally organized in the best possible way, with the best. So this matters where the investment comes from.
So you can separate.
I could potentially remove the effects of offshore centers, which, yeah. So, but you can also argue if the investor to Ukraine, which goes through my home country now of Netherlands, which turns out to be bigger offshore company in the world. This is Ukrainian money, for example, right? So maybe the owners, if they have some expertise, they exploit local knowledge, but for financial reasons, for tax reasons, they reinvest in this particular way. So whether or not we should do this is a other discussion.
We have one question at the back.
Oleg Institute for Economics and Forecasting, the National Academy of Ukraine. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really important for Ukraine. My question is related with what you said, with what we have in Ukraine, and how does it impact on economic development in Ukraine. Since you are from Dnipro region, you know that this region is it's the biggest producer of metallurgy in Ukraine, probably in the world. And we have some examples of FDI in Krivori-Stal. You probably know there is it's a British, French, Indian investor, ArcelorMittal. So what we have, what kind of results we have today from the period that they worked in Ukraine? If we take a look at the work conditions for the employees, we see that conditions is a bit better than average in other metallurgical companies. The employees have good salary, they have medical insurance, they have other benefits. But if we take a look with the number of employees, before the investor came to that plant, there were 40,000 employees. Today they have twice less. So it's a question: how was it achieved, through investment or through the shift of employees? If we take a look at the technology spillover, there is no much changed. This plant is still use this old method of production of metallurgy, and Ukraine probably is the only one country in the world where they used old Martin method of production, which is very costly, and so there is also a question whether there is modern technology spillover and where is innovation. So if we take a look at the impact of this multinational company on economic development, we see the next picture. The number of jobs decreased twice, they deprived of social networks, and which increase the social tension in region. So taking into account what you said with what we have today, why is that? Why that happens? We don't see the technological spillover, we don't see real innovation, and there is a very strong question what would be in the future.
Okay, so the way we think about so there are two questions, but let me keep it short. So basically, if say employees, there could be one of the examples of this positive knowledge spillovers as we advance, right, or measure. So it could be the case that the employees who worked in foreign-owned companies leave for good or for bad reasons the employment, but then they already trained and they were exposed to different ways to work. And if they say open their own business, not in metallurgy, but overall. So somebody who worked for multinational then opens his own business or her own business, or employed in the domestic producers, he has already different set of human capital. So that's the hope. Of course, we need to see what people, where are they ending up, right? But I don't know that. But I know as well that, well, there are some technological advances in metal pipe production, also in the city of Dnipropetrovsk. So Interpipe Corporation was one of the companies that innovate from the very early 90s. Well, yeah. So I think it's a question whether or not it was adoption of technology directly or what. I have friends who were working in the smaller companies who were engaged in the metal working. So I don't know, litio. I don't know what's the way to say it. So melting. So I can assure you they use the new methods and techniques.
And time for last question.
Matteo, Millone of Amsterdam. Thank you very much for the presentation, like your identification strategy very much. But so this increase in total factor productivity that you say could also come with the risk of complicating your paper too much from a movement towards the frontier, a movement along the frontier, or a movement of the frontier itself, right? And usually people go after these, usually using stochastic frontier analysis. Have you thought about doing this? Can you do that with the Orbis data?
Well, I think our yeah, I'm not sure because our time series is a bit short. Yeah, so it's a limitation of that. But
can you maybe just say something whether you think it's it's an increase in the technological frontier or a movement towards the frontier? Can you say something?
No, we didn't think about this. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, and let's thank again our speaker. Our next presenter is Oleg Itskhoki from Princeton University, and he will be talking about optimal development policies with financial frictions.
Thank you very much. So how do I use this? I just need to hold it. This one. Okay. So it's very exciting to be here. My first time actually. Okay, thanks. My first time in Kyiv, and I'm very excited to learn about the country and the economy. So I want to continue the discussion of industrial policies. I'm going to switch gears, and it's not going to be an empirical analysis. There's going to be a theoretical investigation of sort of circumstances when certain industrial policies are justified. And this is a work with my famous colleague, Ben Mo. So basically, we are after this very sort of big question of whether there is room for the governments to intervene during the development stages and other sort of some policies that the governments can pursue that would accelerate economic development. And that's something we want to understand theoretically. And so also we want to think about questions. If there is room for the government to intervene, sort of what types of taxes or subsidies it could use, in which way those taxes or subsidies can come, sort of which sectors it should target, and so on. So this is sort of the normative part of the analysis. And then there is a natural positive part associated with this. Is empirically, we just see countries do quite a lot of things. So countries intervene in a variety of product and factor markets in various ways across countries. And the question is it something crazy that the governments do and they better off actually not doing at all and just letting the markets do their job? Or under certain circumstances, what we observe in the data the governments do is actually well justified? So these are the two questions we're going to try to address here. And this is sort of a motivating table which shows that if you look at most of the developing countries, so these are mostly Asian countries, or all of them are Asian countries here, you see that these countries pretty much did all sorts of interventions into the markets, right? So for example, one of the sort of popular measures that the countries do is called wage suppression. So the countries pursue policies that suppress wage growth. They're trying to, do stuff that keeps wages lower than the productivity growth, right? And the question is like, why in the world would you want to ever do that, right? Under which circumstances that could be a good idea? If, you think in the end of the day, we're after sort of GDP per capita and, high wage rates, why countries might find it interesting to suppress wages? So the other policies, they include subsidizing credit, subsidizing the purchase of intermediates, subsidizing export activities, and most of these policies are kind of completely ubiquitous across many developing countries. And so these are the countries that actually grew very well, right? And so the question, did these countries grow despite of these policies, or actually these policies kind of helped with this? And so we have here a quote from the president of Korea in the 60s. And Korea is an interesting country because it's one of the very few countries that made a successful transition from developing to developed countries, right? It's almost a unique example out there. So, and so what their policy, they consciously tried to keep the nominal wage growth below the inflation plus productivity growth. In fact, they had targets to not have wages grow faster than 80% of what would be sort of the natural counterpart to it, right? And so they had these things they would call year 65. It would be a year to work hard, right? And then year 66 was called a year to work harder, right? And so the question is it some crazy sort of whim of the semi-authoritarian leader, or actually it has a good rationale behind this, right? And so if you take the most basic model we use in economics, sort of the foundation of sort of macro analysis, this would be a neoclassical growth model. In the context of that model, these policies are completely crazy. You just don't want to do any of that. These policies are, well, you can prove first, second welfare theorems, which says that you basically need to let the markets do the job and try to provide the framework for markets to work, but do as little interventions as possible of this sort. And so we want to think about an environment where we sort of give economic model a shot to try to speak to these policies, right, and say under which circumstances they can be favorable. So the related set of policies are associated with exchange rate, and so one other popular policy is keeping exchange rate undervalued, right, and the question is under which circumstances this exchange rate devaluation policies could also be useful. Right. So naturally, if you want to start thinking about these policies, you need to depart from the neoclassical growth model. In Eric's discussion yesterday, so he had, I guess, a particular model in mind. That was a model of coordination failures, where the government plays a role of providing coordination, right? And so you can think of this as maybe some agglomeration effect. So if you're thinking about, Chinese industrial zones, as sort of you promote coordination of production and space, and so the government can help resolve the coordination problem in the private market. So this is not something we're going to do here. So what Vadym did just before, it was an empirical investigation of technological spillovers. It's also an important source of potential, coordination that maybe the government can help with if it's not internalized by the markets. But in this paper, we're going to go a different route. So the departure from the neoclassical model we're going to take would be to introduce financial frictions into the model. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take a completely workhorse model that's used in the development economics to think about, economic development under financial friction. So the idea would be that the production is done by a variety of heterogeneous entrepreneurs, and these entrepreneurs are characterized both by the productivity of their ideas and also by the financial constraints that they face. And over time, if entrepreneurs are successful, they can, make profits and relax their financial constraints, but that takes time. And so in the short run, the productivity of the economy is constrained not only by the physical productivity, but also by how tight the financial constraints are. And as economy grows, it relaxes the financial constraints, and this helps achieve higher productivity levels. And this is kind of the workhorse model in the development analysis, right? So we're going to take this model, and we're going to ask the question whether, the laissez-faire equilibrium, when the government doesn't intervene, whether it has certain efficiency properties, and whether the government has room to sort of intervene into product or factor markets and improve the development trajectories in this economy. Right? And so the idea, the mechanism here would be that, financial frictions, they result in misallocation of resources, which results in low productivity. And the question is, does the government want to do something that's feasible for the government in order to kind of affect this, this dynamics? on the technical side, I mean, this is sort of a standard model, and we're going to ask a very standard question. The reason why it kind of has not been done before, these models have a complicated structure because the state space is a joint distribution of basically productivity and wealth of entrepreneurs. So you need to know in this economy sort of who has the good ideas and who has the money to implement the ideas, right? And this is an endogenous object in this model, and it's a sort of a technically a complicated thing to solve. So we're going to sort of do some innovations here which allow to simplify the model quite a bit and sort of make it tractable. And the idea is that this exercise would be, sort of very simple theoretical investigation, but the idea is that the trade-offs that we can identify here, they probably persist in more, general, bigger quantitative versions of these environments, right? And sort of to go a little bit ahead, the nature of the market failure in this economy, it would be a type of a pecuniary externality where because the financial market is constrained, because the capital is not in the hands of most productive producers, it would create a pecuniary externality in other markets. So in particular in the labor market, right? So the entrepreneurs that are productive but do not have the financial wealth to get capital, they will be facing sort of tight labor market conditions, and they will have hard time hiring labor. And so what the planner can do is, by means of various subsidies, it could help the financially constrained firms to sort of get to the right scale of production and relax their constraints, which will allow them to sort of accumulate resources over time and get to sort of higher productivity for the whole economy in the next periods. So hopefully this will sort of come out clearer from the next slides. So our main insights here is that there are phases of optimal development policies. So the optimal development policies are sort of not uniform during transition. So the early transition, when the economies are particularly financially constrained, this is the time for the governments to do pro-business policies or pro-capitalist policies. So in other words, what we're going to show is that even a Hugo Chavez-style planner who claims that he doesn't care about businesses at all, but only cares about the workers and households, even this kind of planner who puts completely zero weight on the business sector would find it optimal to adopt pro-business policies. So if he thinks about labor market policies, he would want to adopt policies that do not put too much bargaining power on the side of the workers. He would adopt policies that are pro-capitalist in the sense that, adopt favorable policies for businesses in the labor market. This would be something that would help the businesses accumulate profits faster and get unconstrained faster. And even if you only care about the worker welfare intertemporally, you would find this the optimal thing to do. And this would be quite the opposite of sort of the rigid labor markets or the union allocation in the labor markets, right? And so what's interesting here is that over time, as the economy grows and relaxes the financial frictions, it would be optimal to do the transition to more sort of European-style, more rigid labor markets, right? Where there is a lot more bargaining power on the part of the workers relative to the firms. And this way, the planner will achieve the sort of redistribution of away from firms towards the workers in this economy. But this is optimal only later on when economy is sufficiently unconstrained. And so this sort of provides a rationale for sort of quite different labor market institutions adopted across the world. So if you think about it, the European-style labor market institutions were adopted in Latin American countries, and those countries, for a variety of reasons, but maybe this is one, they didn't have a spectacular growth outcomes. Well, if you think about the Asian countries, they adopted very pro-capitalist kind of anti-labor labor markets, very different from the European institutions. And these countries are the ones that grew very well in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And sort of the idea is that sort of maybe there is no uniform optimal labor market institutions. Maybe you want to start with something pro-capitalist, and over time you kind of converge to the European-style labor market institutions. So this would be one interpretation of the switch from pro-business to pro-labor, market institutions. And then I'm going to get to it a little later. So the first part of the analysis would be done in the one-sector economy, and then we're going to generalize it to a multi-sector economy where you can think about issues like comparative advantage and to what extent the government should support the comparative advantage sectors. And also we'll be able to think about the exchange rate policies in a multi-sector environment. Okay, so I'm going to try to make it less technical, but this is one slide which sort of sets up the environment. And I'm going to go over the environment, and hopefully it would be sort of the last technical slide. So the idea is So we're going to make a bunch of assumptions here which make the environment analytically tractable. So the first assumption, we're going to say that the economy is populated by both workers and entrepreneurs. And so the workers are this sort of very basic agents in the economy. They maximize their intertemporal utility, which is a utility over consumption and a disutility over labor. And they're subject to a deterministic budget constraint that they can save, they can consume or save, and they get the wage income, and they can get capital income on their savings, right? And so they just, the two actions that the workers do here, they choose to supply labor to the market, and they choose how much they save, right? And so this is sort of this very basic actions that they need to do. The entrepreneurs, this is the interesting part of the economy, is the sectors of the entrepreneurs. And so the entrepreneurs, there is a continuum of entrepreneurs that differ in their wealth and their productivity. And productivity evolves over time, exogenously, and they can accumulate wealth endogenously, right? And so what the entrepreneurs do, they choose to consume over time, so they maximize their utility of consumption, but they face risk. So they maximize the expected utility of consumption, and they're subject to these budget constraints. So this is the accumulation of wealth equation. So the accumulation of wealth comes from the interest income that they can make on their wealth minus the consumption, plus if they're productive enough, they can make profits, right? And the profits depend both on the productivity Z of the entrepreneurs and the wealth of the entrepreneurs. And sort of, if we were in the neoclassical world, the profit depend only on the productivity. They should not depend on the wealth. So what makes this model non-neoclassical is the fact that wealth becomes sort of a factor of production. And so this is how the profits are formed in this economy. So this part is a very standard neoclassical piece where entrepreneurs have the production function with aggregate productivity big A, idiosyncratic productivity Z, and then they need to hire K units of capital and N units of labor. And they need to pay wages to labor and rental rate to capital, right? And so this would be the completely standard neoclassical production function, but there is a kind of a leverage or collateral constraint imposed on them. So they cannot get, so this is this collateral constraint here, which says that they cannot get more capital than some multiple of their wealth. So the financial markets only support borrowing up to a multiple of the wealth. Right? And this number lambda, you can think of it being 1, which would mean then they have to self-finance the whole production, or if it's bigger than 1, then they can go to the bank and get a credit, but the credit would be proportional to the collateral that they can post, right? And so this constraint will be binding. It would be particularly binding early on when entrepreneurs are not wealthy, right? When entrepreneurs are poor, there are maybe lots of good ideas out there, but implementing ideas requires financing, and to the extent the wealth A is low, it would be hard to get the resources, and the economy would be constrained, right? And then we're going to impose something on the productivity evolution, and so this is a bit of a technical assumption. And the analysis can be generalized, but the fact that productivity would be IID and drawn from a Pareto distribution would make the analysis particularly tractable. So this is the environment. So the way we deal with the environment, we need to figure out the optimal actions of the entrepreneurs. Then we need to aggregate the sections, and then we need to sort of find the equilibrium in the economy and look over time at the dynamics of this equilibrium. And on top of this, we're going to have a government, a planner, who will be endowed with certain policy tools. And we're going to ask sort of, is there an optimal way to use those tools for the government? So I'm going to skip through most of this analysis. So let me emphasize one thing. So what makes this economy particularly tractable is this first equation here. So it's sort of a bank solution for investment by entrepreneurs. So if they have productivity above some cutoff level, they will choose to get as much capital as possible up to their constraint, lambda A. Right? So they will go to the bank and get as much capital as they can if they're productive enough. If they're below this productivity level, they will choose not to get any capital. They will just save the wealth that they have. They will post it to the bank and save it. Right? And so the idea is that this cutoff for productivity above which entrepreneurs produce would be an endogenous object, and as economy develops, it will be growing over time, right? So the idea would be that when the economy is underdeveloped, it has little financial resources, quite a number of unproductive entrepreneurs will have to participate in the markets and hire labor and capital just because the productive entrepreneurs are constrained. And this would be the source of productivity loss in this economy, right? So when the economies are undercapitalized, part of the production would be done by the unproductive agents in the economy. So in the undercapitalized economies, even when people have good ideas, they cannot get financing for that, and people with less good ideas have to fill the void. And as the economy develops, the financial markets become better at transferring financial resources from people with wealth to people with ideas. And that's sort of the nature of the development process here. That would happen on its own, but the government can intervene and sort of alter this process in some ways, which we're going to explore whether this can be beneficial or not. So when you solve through this economy, what you get, so let me focus on this equation. So this would be the GDP of the economy. It would be like the aggregate production function in the economy. And it would turn out, it would be a small open economy, so the economy in principle could get as much capital as it wants, but the entrepreneurs would be constrained in how much individual entrepreneurs can get capital. So the economy as a whole is unconstrained in terms of capital flows, but the individual entrepreneurs are. And so as a result, the aggregate GDP in this economy would be a function of only two things. It would be a function of labor, how much labor resources the economy has, and it would be a function of X, which would be the aggregate financial wealth in the economy. So unlike the neoclassical world where financial wealth is not a factor of production, here if you write the reduced form production function, financial wealth becomes a limiting factor of production. It becomes like capital, but it's not the physical capital here. It's the financial wealth of the entrepreneurial sector that limits production. Right? And so when we're going to think of the economy starting with a low level of financial wealth X and gradually accumulating it over time. Right? Okay. So what we can do next, well, first of all, what we can show that this economy is inefficient in the following sense. So if you look at the return available to households and unproductive entrepreneurs, it would be just the interest rate R. While if you look at the productive entrepreneurs, they can make a return on capital which is greater than R if they're above the productivity cutoff. And so ideally, sort of in the neoclassical world, what you'd like to do is take the money from people with low return and give it to people with high return, right? But here the financial markets cannot support it because of the financial constraints, right? And so what the planner will try to do is it will try to use every tool available to the planner to sort of try to go around this problem and try to kind of put resources into the hands of the productive agents who have returns that are above the sort of market clearing interest rate. So what we're going to do, so this is the planner's problem that we're going to be solving here. So this is what I mentioned. This is the Hugo Chavez planner who claims that he only cares about the workers. He only puts weight on the utility of the workers. So this would be sort of the most conservative analysis where the planner cares not at all about the entrepreneurs, about the business sector. And the question is, under these circumstances, whether he would want to actually carry out pro-business policies, right? So this is sort of the conservative benchmark for us. And so what we prove in the paper is that the planner can implement any allocation in this economy that's subject to these two aggregate constraints. So this is kind of interesting. So we started with this economy with heterogeneous entrepreneurs. It's like this complex economy where there are people that are different, that they have to, solve optimal actions, then the sections have to be aggregated. But in the end of the day, it turns out that you can write the aggregate problem of the planner as just subject to two constraints at the aggregate. And so what is the interpretation of these constraints? Well, the first constraint is like a consolidated budget constraint of the government and the household sector, right? So you put together the government and the household sector, and this is the consolidated budget constraint. What we used here is that the wage bill in the economy would be a fraction of GDP. So 1 minus alpha of the GDP would be the wage bill in the economy. And this is a neoclassical feature of the economy here. And then the second equation, this is the wealth dynamics in the economy. So X is the wealth and X dot is the wealth dynamics. And sort of we made a bunch of the assumptions to linearize this economy so that you only care about the dynamics of the aggregate wealth in the entrepreneurial sector. And so the aggregate wealth accumulates so essentially this is the profit share of the economy. So in the neoclassical world, the profits are zero. Here, because of the financial frictions, the entrepreneurial sector has positive profits, and they're also a fraction of the GDP. And so what's interesting about this economy is, if you just look at these equations, this would look a lot like a learning by doing economy. So if you reinterpret X instead of financial wealth, if you think of it as sort of learning, amount of knowledge in the economy, so this equation looks like a learning by doing, right? So you do production, and the production helps you to accumulate knowledge right? And then knowledge shows up as a factor in the production, right? So sort of if you know Krugman 87 JD, it would be sort of a special case in a way of Krugman, Journal of Development Economics paper with learning by doing. But the point here is it's not at all about learning by doing. It's not a physical technological externality. It's about the financial constraints that restrict the production and the economy. And sort of the financial constraints oftentimes can look like, sort of a learning by doing friction, but the micro nature of the friction is quite different. So this is sort of the first thing to note. So in terms of technically how we're going to solve this problem, so we're going to have this object that we call nu here. So that would be a cost state variable for the financial wealth. And basically whether this cost state, it's like a Lagrange multiplier. Essentially it says, whether the planner wants to put an extra dollar in the hands of entrepreneurs, right? When nu is greater than 1, it means that the planner prefers, if he had an extra dollar, he would rather give it to the business sector and not to the households. Even when the planner cares only about households, there could be circumstances when he would choose to give the extra dollar to the entrepreneurial sector. And the reason for that is that the entrepreneurial sector is important for productivity in this economy. And sometimes giving a dollar to the entrepreneurial sector can relax the constraints on production so much that the households will benefit from this, right? So we're not going to endow the planner with the simple tool of being able to just take money from households and give it to entrepreneurs. We're going to sort of make things a little more interesting here. We're going to say that the planner can only sort of design the rules in the labor markets, for example. Or maybe he can subsidize credit costs for the entrepreneurs, but it's not going to be direct transfers, right? And so you can think of a variety of reasons why the government can be constrained in the direct financial transfers to entrepreneurial sectors, right? And so this is what we're going to ask here is like, is there something that the planner can do about the aggregate savings in the economy or about aggregate labor supply in the economy, which would improve sort of the fate of the households and workers, right? And so this would be the answer. So if you solve through this problem, this is the first order condition intertemporally, how much the planner wants to save. And it turns out that the planner would not want to distort the saving that's done by the private market. So essentially you get the same solution for savings as the private market would achieve. So in this economy there is no reason to do intertemporal things, right? So I'm probably not going to get much time, but if you think like the next analysis that we'll do would be about exchange rate interventions. And exchange rate interventions, they have a flavor of intertemporal interventions, right? And so in this economy, the first best interventions would not involve intertemporal interventions. So you would never want to use exchange rate interventions if you have more direct policy tools. That's essentially what this result means. But the planner does want to intervene in the static markets. It wants in particular to intervene in the labor market here. And so the idea is that this is the first order condition, and it would have been the sort of optimal, it would have been the optimal laissez-faire allocation by the private sector if the threat term was 0. So the threat term means the departure from the private market allocation. And so you can interpret it as a tax or subsidy in the labor market. And so essentially there are two effects. So there is the monopoly effect. So you can call this thing as a tax on labor, and you can decompose the tax on labor into a static piece and into a dynamic piece. So there is the monopoly effect, which means that the planner wants to behave as a labor union, right? Because the planner cares only about the households in this economy. There is the piece of his problem which makes him want to behave like a labor union on behalf of the workers and maximize the rents that the workers can extract from the businesses. But there is also a dynamic effect. It's this dynamic externality that comes from the fact that entrepreneurial sector can accumulate wealth in this economy. And so this dynamic externality depends on whether this Lagrange multiplier is smaller or bigger than 1. So remember, this Lagrange multiplier was, whether he wants to put, if he had an extra dollar, would it want to give it to the, entrepreneurial sector. And what you see here, if this Lagrange multiplier is greater than 1, he wants the dollar in the hands of the entrepreneurial sector. What he wants to do is to depart in the other direction from the union allocation in the labor market. So he wants to be sort of anti-union in the labor market. He wants to basically force people to work more in the short run. By working more in the short run, they increase the total pie of production in the economy, and this increases both labor income and profits, and higher profits relax the financial constraints next period, right? So this is sort of the idea of the planner here. So basically, you can solve through this, and what you find, this is a phase diagram for this economy. So there is a saddle pass on which the planner wants to be. That's the red line. And so X is the financial wealth, the state variable. And if you start with low enough financial wealth, if you start here, you want to subsidize labor. You want to subsidize in labor here means you want to force people to supply more hours in the labor market. So like if you go back to this quote from Park in Korea saying this is the year to work hard, this model exactly rationalizes that the planner wants to sort of force people to work hard early on in the transition when the economy is financially constrained. So they work hard here. So this is the tax on labor. So you start with a subsidy forcing them to work sort of more. At some point, when you reach the level of financial development that's high enough, that's close enough to the steady state, you switch to taxing labor, which means you make people work less. It becomes sort of the union allocation in the economy. You restrict the labor hours in the economy. And so basically here you look like Korea during the 60s and 70s, and here you start to look like the developed Europe, right? And so these are the different phases of development. Okay, very good. Okay. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about implementation. So in this economy, the simple interpretation that we just took is that the planner has access to like a subsidy or a tax on labor. Typically, this is not what the planners do in reality. So there are a number of ways to sort of implement these policies. So if you think about Soviet Union back in the late 20s and 30s during the Stalin times, I think this model is actually fairly well describes what type of friction that Stalin was facing. So he had a very tight financing constraint. He only could basically finance the capital investment out of the current production by trading with sort of Europe, exchanging grain for machines. And so, basically what's the natural way you can relax the constraints? Well, you use forced labor. So that's pretty much exactly what he did in the 30s. And so this model kind of explains why it was actually, if you buy into this mechanism, that's exactly what the planner would want to do in this mechanism, even if you sort of buy into the assumption that you care only about the households and workers, which are obviously strong assumptions. But even if you bought into those assumptions, this is kind of the optimal thing to do. Clearly, this is not the types of, sort of allocation that we have in mind as a sort of a suggestion for policies, but they achieve sort of the same goals, right? So the things that we do have in mind, which are sort of kind of both ubiquitous and even in democracies or sort of semi-democracies, is sort of the market regulation policies. So even if you don't talk about the direct subsidies to labor, you can think about creating labor regulations that have a pro-business tilt in them, pro-capitalist tilt in them. And so basically, if you think about that, style of policies adopted by Asia, these are the policies that sort of shift bargaining in the labor market towards the firms away from the workers, right? And this will achieve the same goals, right? If the bargaining is shifted towards the workers, it will redistribute, the pie in the labor market away from workers towards the businesses, and that's exactly what the planner would want here during early transition. And then it's important that the planner at some point wants to switch to redistributing the other way. And basically, so the idea here is if you start your transition and you identify the financial friction as the key constraint, you don't want to go and develop very sort of kind of advanced European-style labor market institution. That would hurt your financial development, right? The idea is that you want to start with fairly pro-capitalist tilt in the labor market institution and then gradually transition to more European-style labor market institutions. Right? Okay, and so what's the nature of the inefficiency here? Well, the nature of the inefficiency, which I mentioned, is this pecuniary externality. So you have, wealth in the hands of fairly unproductive people early on, and this, the entrepreneurs that don't have good ideas but have wealth, right? They will be still hiring labor in the labor market, and they will be bidding the wages of labor up in the labor market, right? And so this imposes a pecuniary externality on the entrepreneurs that have good ideas but don't have the financial wealth. So in the neoclassical environment, pecuniary externality is the ones that operate through sort of wages, through labor market, for example. The planner should not care about them because all the margins are optimal in the neoclassical world. In this world, the return on capital is not equalized between businesses, and it creates this pecuniary externality through the labor market, which hurts the productive but undercapitalized entrepreneurs. And what the planner wants to do, it wants to reduce wages, suppress wage growth in the labor market, in order to relax the constraints of the productive but undercapitalized entrepreneurs, right? And this is actually the efficient thing to do, even if you only care about workers in this economy. So in our analysis, we sort of extend this to multiple potential policy tools, which can include things like, revenue subsidies to firms, capital or credit subsidies to firms, and sort of the general logic of the analysis here says that the planner, unless he can implement the first best allocation, the second best allocation would always involve a pro-business tilt early on, and this pro-business tilt will be proportional to whether this Lagrange multiplier is greater than 1. So as long as the planner wants to put the marginal dollar in the hands of the business sector, he would use all policy tools available to him. This is kind of this standard second best analysis. He will use both the wage subsidies and the capital subsidies in the same direction in order to sort of help capitalize the financial sector. So it's not like labor subsidies and capital subsidies are substitutes here. They're actually complements. You want to use them both at the same time, whichever tool is sort of available to the planner. And sort of the general pattern here is that there would be a pro-business tilt during early transition. Again, if you identify the financial friction as the key friction limiting the development of the economy. So let me finish on a multi-sector analysis. I kind of mentioned a little bit about the exchange rate policies. So exchange rate policies can never emerge as the second best tool. They can only emerge as a third best tool when you don't have access to more static policy instruments like credit subsidies or labor subsidies. In the absence of those, you would go to distorting intertemporal margins. You would go to using capital controls on exchange rate policies. But these tools are more crude. They distort sort of more margins in the economy. They have to distort the savings margin with sort of the same goals, and this is an indirect way to get at the friction, right? So that's why exchange rate policies have to be justified by saying that you actually don't have access to more basic tools like subsidies. It's hard to identify who to subsidize. So you have to use this very crude, policy of exchange rate under devaluation. But I want to finish on an analysis of competitive advantage sectors. So if you write down here a multi-sector economy with competitive advantage, the interesting result here is that short-run competitive advantage and long-run competitive advantage of the economy is different. In the long run, the competitive advantage of the economy is characterized by sort of the technological constraints on the economy. So the technologically more advanced sectors would be the comparative advantage sectors. But in the short run, so in the long run, it's this productivity shifter, the TFP shifter that shapes the competitive advantage. In the long run, the competitive advantage would be shaped also by the financial constraints on the sectors. So there could be some sectors that more or less financially constrained. And so here's the picture. So we're going to have an economy in which you have two sectors, and sector 0 is the long-run competitive advantage sector, and sector 1 is the short-run competitive advantage sector, which is less financially constrained. And so the solid lines here would be basically the transition of wealth in the sector if you don't intervene, and the dashed line is if the planner optimally intervenes in the economy. And so what you see, the planner would want to basically speed up the transition over time. It would want to subsidize the long-run competitive advantage sector. And so here's the kind of analogy that I have in the US. I mean, it's a bit of an artificial example, but I think it illustrates what happens. So think about 1960s. So in the 1960s, you have tobacco industry in US. It's one of the wealthiest industries. It's sort of a super capitalized industry. It has sort of all the resources it wants, but it's an industry that sort of is dying, right? So probably somebody could forecast that 50 years from now, the tobacco industry is not going to be sort of this frontier wealth industry. At the same time, you have the high-tech industry in the Silicon Valley, which is basically people doing small computers in their garages, right? So if you think about, Steve Jobs, he has the garage in the 70s, and he, assembles Apple I and Apple II in the garage with. And so the optimal allocation in this economy would be for the tobacco sector to go and finance like crazy the technological sector. But the financial frictions, they limit to what extent this wealth transfer can happen, right? What it says is if you give too much money to Steve Jobs in the 70s, he's going to run away with this money. He won't have incentives to work. I mean, that's sort of how we model it. I'm not sure whether that's sort of the true statement empirically. So the best thing for the tobacco company would be to take their wealth, invest not at all in the tobacco industry because it's sort of about to die in the next 30 years, and instead invest into sort of the frontier industries that are financially constrained. And the financial market in our world cannot sustain this transfer of wealth, right, because of the financial friction. But the government, what it can do, it's sort of the tobacco sector is purchasing resources on the market. It beats up the wages and the whole economy because even being not particularly productive in technological sense, it's being financially unconstrained and it can hire a lot of labor in the labor market. And this imposes a pecuniary externality on the technological sector, which faces high wage rates, right? And so what the planner wants to do in this economy, it wants to either subsidize credit or subsidize labor for the technological sector, if the government can identify, the long-run competitive advantage sector in the economy. So this is the spirit of sort of the mechanism in the model. Then there is a question of to what extent the governments have the tools needed and the information needed to do these policies. It might well be the answer that the governments don't have either the tools or information to do it, but these are the forces built into this environment that the government would want to do if it could, right? And sort of, to bring it a little bit into sort of Ukrainian context, you can also think about the big kind of industrial sector of the economy that's well capitalized, and you can think about sort of the small entrepreneurial sector in the economy, and sort of this would be the analogy to these two sectors that I gave here in the U.S. context. So this brings me to the conclusion. What we identify in this paper, we construct a very specific economy with a very specific friction on it. And the nature of this friction says basically that the planner is better off adopting a pro-business tilt early on for the reason that the business sector is financially constrained. If that's the key friction in the economy, you would want to tilt the policies available to you towards sort of relaxing these financial constraints in the short run, help the business sector accumulate sort of profits and wealth, which would increase actually TFP of the economy dynamically. And sort of this is the spirit of the conclusions here. So let me stop.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Oleg. That was a very interesting paper. I'm a big fan of these collateral constraints, as you know. But sometimes I wonder, when we're looking at these very long-run issues like you are, the fact that imposing these constraints without looking at the contractual relationship between borrowers and lenders may be a shortcoming in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
Because it may be that, say, the issue is limited enforcement of contracts, or the issue is costly monitoring, or the issue is, it could be a variety of things that by not looking under the hood at what is really disturbing the financial markets, that coming around at the other end with these sort of policies that are looking at the reversing the distortions produced by the financial frictions may actually create a conflict. I guess on the other hand, you could say, well, maybe here an alternative to all of this, or a re-representation of the subsidies, is as if the government nationalizes the banks, and then since it has perfect information and knows the guys that need to have the extra capital, they just says, forget your collateral constraint, I'm going to give you the money that you need in this particular economy that you have. I think that is possible. So I wonder about those limitations or caveats. And the second thing is just when you take the models literally, sometimes in these models you get these ideas, these policies look nice, but they're very complex. The stuff you were hitting at the very end, that maybe these policies are at the end things that you can't quite implement as they are, so you look for alternatives. And in some environments, it turns out that not all alternatives are welfare improving. Just ad hoc rules you could come up with, motivated by the same idea that you should subsidize this or tax that, may actually be worse off than doing nothing.
Yeah, no, so these are both great questions. I'm definitely not going to have enough time to address both of them. So I think the main drawback of this whole literature is that we're working with models which don't specify the financing constraint from basic principles, right? We impose these collateral constraints which do not specify exactly the nature of the friction. So there is the story that the entrepreneur can run away, but they don't specify the exact dynamic friction, right? And so I think that's the first order question for this literature, right? And so we are kind of doing this risque business of going into policy analysis in the world where we don't fully understand the nature of the constraint. So that very well taken. Your criticism here. So in our defense, here are two things that I can say. So we focus on the policies that are first time consistent for the government, so he doesn't want to re-implement them next period, and second, that are implemented in the static markets, so they don't involve the intertemporal thing. So for example, the best policy here would be to give a transfer to entrepreneurs and then promise to tax them in the future. Those types of policies we think would be not incentive compatible for reasons outside the model, and so we don't pursue them, right? But they would be even better policies than the one that we do. We do very basic kind of policies of just very crudely intervening in the whole labor market, which require very little information and very little sort of commitment on the part of the government. That's a completely static policy. The second thing which we don't do here is we don't do targeted subsidies to specific guys with high productivity, because we think that this is very hard to identify who is the high productivity firm. It's not necessarily going to stay high productivity firm next period. Sort of Ben has another paper which was called Well-Intended Policies, where you start subsidizing, the firms that seem productive today. The subsidies get locked in, these companies keep getting the subsidies in the future, but they're no longer at the technological frontier, and sort of in the short run it can improve things, but then if you don't switch these policies fast enough, right, you're going to get, and so Korea was criticized for having the subsidy policies in place for too long. They should have switched them earlier, but then you're subject to political constraints. So this is not something that we focus on. That's why we think our conclusions are more robust, even if we don't fully understand the nature of the friction. We sort of do like a very basic policies. And exactly like if information constraints on the policies are so tough that you actually cannot do the second best tools, you're going to have to switch to third best tools, like exchange rate policies. And so in our environment, they would be still beneficial. But of course, once you switch to third best policies, their costs are bigger relative to the same benefits. And sort of eventually you might want to say that I don't want to do it at all. That's totally possible here.
Thanks. Question from...
May I ask a very quick question? So basically, would increase the retirement wage the sort of policies which would be feasible and politically achievable? And second, of course, yeah. So, well, of course, an economy like Ukraine, so we discussed, so we would like to advance and to boost the growth very fast, preferably, right? So, is there, in the context of these models, is there way to achieve the level shift, or is it very gradual process, as in Korea, through generations, really, as your impulse responses show?
Yeah, so we're getting into the dangerous zone here of interpreting.
It's deliberate question.
Yeah, interpreting the model too literally. So if you interpret the model very literally, yes, all sorts of labor policies that, increasing the retirement age, reducing the pensions in the future, right? All of these things, they increase the bargaining power of businesses in the labor market against the workers. And our model says that, if you identify the financial constraint on the economy as the key friction, that sort of is going to be a beneficial policy. If you look at the experience of the Asian countries, a lot of the things they did, they just didn't provide basic protection rights for workers in the workforce. They did not limit the working day as much. They did not provide like restrictions on sort of what should be in the workspace and stuff like that. That also shifts. So it was viewed more as kind of these countries are underdeveloped, and that's why they don't provide all the benefits to workers, right? So obviously, when you start in the economy where a lot of these things were already provided, it's very hard to switch it off, right? And that becomes a very politically contentious thing. And then you have to look at the politically feasible tools that you have. So sometimes maybe doing the credit subsidies to specific industries is more politically feasible. But this is something that stays outside the model, right? The second question about how fast can you do it? No, so in this model, unfortunately, this is a slow financial accumulation process. You cannot jump development here. You can accelerate it on the margin, but it's not something that's going to give you sort of beautiful outcomes with less than one generation, right? And so it's a model that better explains the success of the Asian countries that took like a decade or two, right? Rather than the fast jumps, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I see that we still have questions, but sorry, we have to move to our last presenter in interest of time. Thanks a lot, Oleg, again, and. Our last speaker is Matteo Millone from VU Amsterdam University. He will present Show Me Yours and I Will Show You Mine, sharing borrowing information in a competitive credit market.
Thank you very much. Hello? Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me here. I love being in Kyiv. It's my second time and I'm very happy that I could come back. This paper is an empirical banking paper, and it's a banking regulation paper. And what we do here, we look at the effect of information sharing on credit markets. And by information sharing, we mean the ability all the requirement for lenders to share information with each other about the current indebtedness level of their borrowers and their repayment performance. So this can be achieved in a number of different ways, but what is interesting here and what I think is interesting in the context of this conference is that we're going to look at the introduction of a credit registry. Information sharing can be achieved through a credit bureau, which usually will be a voluntary private institution, but credit registries are usually set up and administered by central banks. In a credit registry, then the lenders are required, and it's mandatory for them to submit information about borrowers so that whenever a borrower applies for a loan, the lender can check the current debt level of this borrower and also their past repayment performance. And this should help inform lending. So they are, so credit registers are instituted for a number of reasons. The main reason, though, is to reduce information asymmetry in credit markets, right? And they do this in two ways, by mitigating directly adverse selection and moral hazard. On the adverse selection side, this is easy to see in the sense that whenever you apply for a loan, then the bank pulls your information from the credit registry, sees how many other outstanding loans you have, and then can better pick the good from the bad borrowers, and also look at whether in the past you have defaulted on a loan or not. But it also improves the incentives for borrowers to repay their loans and simply not take the money and run. Why? Because by repaying timely their previous loans, they can build what we can call a reputational collateral, right? So they can signal whenever they go back for a second loan, they can signal that they're good borrowers to the lender. So the idea is to improve selection and to improve loan quality. These have been introduced in a growing number of advanced and developing countries, and this is the case that we're going to look at today. For instance, so I was looking a bit at the situation here in Ukraine, and I know that you have a number of private credit bureaus. You don't have a credit registry, but I did find a press release from the central bank from 2015 sort of encouraging the idea of introducing one as something that would be beneficial. So the case that I'm going to look at, I'm just going to anticipate a bit, the case that I'm going to look at is Bosnia. And in Bosnia, they had, very similarly to Ukraine, private credit bureaus, but they weren't covering the totality of loans, so they weren't really effective. And then they introduced a credit registry, and this is exactly what I'm going to look at today. So what do we know about information sharing? Well, if we look at the theoretical literature and some of the cross-country evidence, most of the cross-country evidence actually, we see that they're quite beneficial. They seem to significantly reduce adverse selection and moral hazard. And when we look at the empirical evidence, and mostly on cross-country studies, we see that countries with a credit registry or functioning credit bureaus have better credit condition and low loan defaults. However, when we do these cross-country studies, it's very difficult to disentangle the effects of the specific policy of information sharing from general financial development in the country. So we can't really identify the effect very clearly. And this is a bit problematic because as the literature has moved to more micro-evidence, we see that actually the results are not so clear-cut. So for instance, some papers show that a credit bureau might be better than mandatory credit registries. Other papers show the contrary. The paper from Giannetti, Liberti, and Sturges shows that when you introduce information sharing, lenders have an incentive to submit false information or to manipulate the information they submit to the credit registry. And why would this be so? Because if I give information about my borrowers, and this can be seen by the other lenders, I have an incentive to make the information about my good borrowers a little worse and make the information about my bad borrowers a little better. So that my competitors will try to poach and steal the bad borrowers and not the good ones. And then there's anecdotal evidence from the introduction of credit registries, for instance, in the United Arab Emirates. Before they introduced this credit registry, they thought, well, this is going to help credit condition, there's going to be more credit in the economy. Actually, after they introduced it, there was a significant contraction in credit. And why? Because when you do this, you might realize that your borrowers are taking out too many loans at the same time. Right? So this is what happened in the United Arab Emirates. So we want to go and sort of refine and shed more light on this line of literature. So what we do, we look at contract level information. So this is a very micro level data. We have a same lender under different information sharing regimes. So we have a lender before mandatory information sharing, and we have the same lender after mandatory information sharing. And we observe all the loans that disperse over this period of time. By doing this, we're able to use loan officer and borrower fixed effect, and we're going to identify the model using local credit market competition. What is good, what is interesting about our data is that we can really observe the life of the loan from the moment in which the borrower applies for the loan until the moment it's repaid. So we're going to see the effect of information sharing on rejection rate, on loan terms, and then finally on loan quality. And when we look at our loan application data, we also will be able to see and distinguish what is the reason and why a specific loan was rejected or not. So we're going to see, since information sharing increases the quantity of hard information fed into the system, we can see whether actual lender use more of this information in deciding whether to grant a loan or not. So, as I anticipated, we're going to look at the introduction of the Central Register Creditor in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the Bosnia situation is interesting because they had a private bureau since the year 2000. But submission of data to this bureau was voluntary, and thus coverage was not complete. When we talk to loan officer in Bosnia, which, by the way, from 2000 to 2009, when we have the introduction of a credit registry, pretty much double the amount of credit in the country, loan officers said they felt they were completely blind with respect to the current indebtedness level of their borrowers and their past performance. So this was an unreliable system of information sharing. So in 2009, the Central Bank of Bosnia introduced the credit registry, expanded its coverage to all lenders operating in the country. So to banks, non-banking financial institution, and microfinance institution. And this, as far as credit registries go, is a pretty good one because it requires information of all existing loans, all past loans and repayments, if this information is available from the borrower, and also provides information about the collateral which is attached to each loan and whoever is guaranteeing this loan. Guarantees are a big thing in Bosnia. Most people, a lot of borrowers don't have access to high quality collateral, so usually they will use a guarantor. But then what it turned out is that people were guaranteeing multiple loans at the same time, and for lenders there was no way to understand how many of these loans were guaranteed, and people were guaranteeing each other's loans, right? So they were really very helpful in improving these contracts. So we have a loan portfolio of over 200,000 loans approved between June 2002 and June 2012. For these loans, we have size, maturity, interest rate, all the loan characteristics, and we also have repayment history, and we also know how much of these loans was recovered. We can observe then and identify 430,000 unique borrowers distributed over 458 loan officers. Importantly, about these borrowers, we know a lot. We know their income, we know their education, we know their age and gender. So how do we identify this? As I said before, we look at the life of the loan from the moment that the borrower applied for the loan until the moment the loan is fully repaid or defaulted on. But of course, we don't want to do simply an event study. We want to try to identify the model more accurately. So we use two sources of additional variation for this. One of these is the amount of competition. Why the amount of competition? Because if you think in the extreme case in which there's only one lender, if you introduce information sharing, this is useless. I know everything there is to know already about whoever has borrowed before. If you increase the number of lenders and the competition in a certain area, then the possibility that my prospective borrower might be borrowing for other 5 lenders at the same time, or that he is defaulted, he or she is defaulted on a previous loan with another lender, is just switching lender every time it defaults, this probability increases. So the usefulness of information sharing increases as well. The other source of variation we're going to use is the difference between first-time borrowers and returning borrowers. A first-time borrower is much more opaque for the lender compared to a returning borrower. If someone is coming back for his fifth loan, I already know quite a bit about this borrower. If it's a first-time borrower, then I don't know much. So we expect whichever effect we find to be stronger for first-time borrowers. So we run a number of specifications. So usually what we will be interested in will be this coefficient here, beta, which is the coefficient on the interaction between credit registry and competition. We saturate the model with branch fixed effect, time fixed effect, and we also allow the model to have group-specific trends. So I'm going to show a number of specifications. These simply have different levels of fixed effect and different level of these group-specific trends. So let's start from the extensive margin. This is loan application, and let's see what happens. We see that when the credit registry is introduced, right here, we see that there is an increase in rejection rates overall in all the branches. But we see that this effect is even stronger when competition is higher. Right here, right? So we see, initially, we see there is a contraction in credit, sort of consistent with the United Arab Emirates story. So when the credit registry is introduced, lenders realize that the level of indebtedness in the country might be quite high, and there's a contraction in credit. So we want to see why this is the case, what drives this contraction in credit, right? Because maybe it could simply just be something that it's because of worsening condition in the economy. So we can look at why a loan was rejected, and we can divide this between public information, which is the information which is provided by the credit registry. This can be positive, meaning the outstanding level, the outstanding number of loans attached to each borrowers, or negative, meaning prior defaults with other lender. And with private information, this is information which is private to the lender itself, so this is information that they collected about the borrower themselves. So what we expect the rejection based on public information will become stronger after the credit registry. And this is indeed what we see. We see there's a strong increase, this is a multinomial logic, there is a strong increase in rejection based on public information and on hard information. Soft information becomes less relevant, right? So there's really a shift in the way loan officers decide whether to give loans or not. There's more public information fed by the credit registry, and this information is used to a greater extent to reject loans. So once these loans are dispersed, we then look at what happens to loan terms. We then move to the intensive margin. And in the tables I'm going to show now, we're going to look at loan terms, loan maturity, interest rate, and collateral. And bear in mind, these first tables are going to be only for first-time borrowers, right? So these are borrowers which are unknown to our lender. And we see, again, that as the credit registry is introduced, loans become smaller, and with shorter maturity, and this effect is stronger as we expect in high competition areas. So again, another example of credit contraction for first-time borrower. The same story happens with interest rates. Interest rates go up, stronger effect in high competition area, and more collateral is required for each loan. So for first-time borrower, credit registry is introduced. Contrary to what you would want, you see that actually there's a contraction in credit. So this is not a very good story for credit registries, right? So you would expect them to improve credit conditions, but it seems that they don't. So we look actually at what happens over the life of a relationship between a lender and a borrower. So in this table here, we show the effect over the length of the relationship between the lender and the borrower. So this second, third, and fourth loan dummy here simply represent the change in amount granted, for instance, when a borrower comes back from the second, third, and fourth loan, right? As we would expect, as the relationship goes on between a borrower and a lender, the lender gets to know more about the borrower and relaxes credit condition, right? So he was willing to lend more and give longer loans and lend at a cheaper price, right? So we want to see what happens to this effect once the credit registry is introduced. And we see that when the credit registry is introduced, this effect becomes even stronger. So it means that the credit registries allows the borrower to build what we call this reputational collateral. right? So it's able to get even better credit condition when information sharing is introduced. So this is because of two reasons. One of them is because of this this reputational collateral. It is proven that it's a good borrower, but it can prove this not only to the lender with whom it has a relationship, but also to all the other lenders in the economy. Before, there's this Peter paper that shows that the lender, the incumbent lender, has an information monopoly over the borrower. He knows that the borrower is good, but he's the only one that knows it. And the borrower cannot realistically signal this to the other lender. When you introduce information sharing, then all the other lenders will know that this borrower is a good borrower, and then there will be increased competition for lending to this person. So it will have a higher bargaining power, and will be able to get better loan conditions. So we see then that the story here is a mixed story, right? For first-time borrowers, which when they are opaque and they just enter the credit market, there's a contraction in credit because they have no history, they have no reputational collateral, but once they're able to build some of this becomes more valuable in a situation when there is information sharing, because this information collateral can be spent with the other lenders as well. So we then look at what happens to loan quality. In here, if you bear with me for a second, this is a Kaplan-Meier survival function. This is the probability of a loan not having defaulted at any time after introduction. So it means that in the first quarter, when the loan is dispersed, no loan has defaulted. As more loans default, the line goes down. So we see that before the introduction of the credit registry, which is the solid line, we see that in the first 2 quarters, usually there's a sharp decrease in repayments. This means that if you do, in this case, if you do default on a loan, you will default in the first 2 quarters. And there's some indication that this will be strategic defaults, right? If you're going to take the money and run, you're going to do it early, you're not going to do it later. Right? When the credit registry is introduced, we actually see that the line shifts up, meaning that there are generally better repayment, and the stronger effect seems to happen in the first 2 quarters. Right? So information sharing decreases the incentive for the strategic defaults. Right? Because if I do take the money and run, immediately every other lender in the economy is going to know about it. Right? So it's going to be reputationally very costly for the borrower. So we do, but to identify our model, we do expect this effect to be stronger in areas with higher competition. So this is what we do here. This is before the credit registry, this is after the credit registry. The solid line are low competition area, and the dashed line are high competition area. Consistent with the idea that if there are a lot of lenders, my incentive to not repay a loan and then simply go to another lender, or to take multiple lenders at the same time, is stronger, then repayments before information sharing are usually worse in high competition area. When the credit registry is introduced, we see a general increase in both high and low competition area of repayments, but this effect is particularly strong in high competition area. So it seems to sort of give credit to our identification strategy. We do this also with the Cox proportional hazard model, simply in a semi-parametric form, and we see that the credit registry reduces significantly the number of defaults, and this effect is particularly strong in high competition area. We then go a step further, and we look at the difference between first-time borrowers and returning borrowers, and you see that first-time borrower have there's an even stronger effect for first-time borrower. They repay more of their loan, defaults go down. Again, with the same idea, they would like to build good reputation. I got plenty of time. But remember, this was introduced in July 2009, right? So the obvious comment here is say, well, but this maybe is just a crisis effect, maybe this is just a crisis that's bottoming out. How can you tell that is that it is the credit registry? Well, we do a bunch of robustness tests. I can show more later as well if you want. But simply here I show a simple one. In this one, we simply anticipate the introduction of the credit registry. Right? So we use a placebo test, say, okay, let's imagine it is introduced at T-1, T-2, right? And these are quarters, and we see that when we go back 2 quarters, the effect disappears. So unless there is something else specifically happened in July 2009, which specifically hits more high competition areas than low competition areas, then we're quite confident that the effect we find on repayments is due to the introduction of the credit registry. So the last thing we're going to look at, excuse me, is lender profitability. So, okay, we know because it's not clear now what happened to the profitability of these lenders, right? Because we see that they started lending less, but there were also less defaults. So what we do, because we have the entire repayment data with some very simple assumption, we can sort of calculate the net present value of lending. So this is before registry. After registry, the first column shows the present value of new lending. We show that there is a contraction in credit, so this lender lends less, so the net present value of these new loans is lower. However, so sorry, this is the, but we also see that there's in this darker gray line, we see that there's a significant decrease in defaults. So despite the fact that the net present value for these new loans is marginally lower, we see from the red bar that the net present value per dollar lent is higher. So there is less lending, sure, but this is better lending. Every dollar lent is more profitable under the information sharing regime. So to conclude, we see that after the introduction of the credit registry, there is a tightening of lending, and this is specifically strong at the extensive margin. And the reason why this increase in loan rejection at the extensive margin seems to be driven mostly by the new public information which is present in the market and is given by the new credit registry. We see the lending is also tighter at the intensive margin, but this is only for first-time borrowers. So these are borrowers which don't have a credit history. So they're more opaque, and given the fact that you can find a lot more information about the other borrowers, you're going to tend to lend less to these first-time borrowers. However, because switching costs are lower, because the reputational collateral is higher, and because now these borrowers which have a good credit history can signal their quality to the competitors, switching costs are lower, so they are able to gain better loan condition. This tighter lending standard, however, leads to better repayment, and this is reflected in higher profitability. We identified a model, again, I said, using variability at the branch level, using different levels of competition and losing differences between first and returning borrowers, and this seems to increase the strength of the effects. So what we see is that there's indeed a short-term reduction in open borrowing. This contraction in credit, that was sort of the main goal of this introduction of the credit registry in Bosnia, was to sort of stop the proliferation of overborrowing. But people were taking multiple loans at the same time. It seemed to have stopped this effect. However, you don't want to have a permanent contraction in credit, right? You would like this to facilitate the credit condition. And this is something that will have to be explored on a longer term, especially given, so we expect that as a result of better repayments, then this will lead to a sort of a virtuous cycle of borrowers building up a good reputational collateral and being able then to access better lending condition in the future. And the impact varies across borrower. I think this is very important when designing this type of policy. You will have to expect that it will not hit every borrower in the same way. The very opaque borrowers, the borrowers without history, might experience an initial contraction in credit. And this will be because there will be a reduced lock-in effect. So in the end, to conclude, we think that in the Bosnian situation, the stated target of reducing overborrowing and improving loan quality was definitely a success, but again, as policy recommendation or as to the lesson to be learned from this is that these effects will not be equal for all borrowers. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you for interesting report. I have a question to you. how credit agencies and any kind of non-institutional decisions about how to share information may help then borrowers play intertemporal game. Let's say, to build up the reputation during first stage and to behave opportunistically in the next stage. What do you think about this?
So I think, for instance, that borrower seems to play the system very well. For instance, in Bosnia, initially, information was updated every 15 days in the credit registry. Right? And then they had to change this very quickly after 1 year because people were taking 4 loans within the 15 days, right? And now it is updated daily. I definitely think that what you say, meaning that the borrowers will simply going to build up this reputational collateral and then eventually default on later loan, might indeed happen, right? But so this is not the complete solution to moral hazard concern, right? Of course, this has to be, this has to come hand in hand with collateral requirements, for instance. But you would expect, right? So if I'm the guy that built up good reputational collateral over 5, 6 loans, you would expect then that you will have built up enough collateral then to use that to secure your loans, right? So this will be, but my feeling with this is that borrowers become very sophisticated into trying to exploit the limitation of these credit registries, right? So it is very important when designing one to take into account of all of this, for sure. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question on the right.
Well, thank you for the interesting presentation. My question concerns a correspondence between credit bureau and credit register, or maybe more widely, this is your point of view about the better organization of this market of the sharing of information. From one side, in Ukraine, we have the 12 years of history credit bureau development. This is private bureau, and the preference of this that the competitive market organize different advanced products to estimate borrowers for credit risk. From other side, this is not centralized. The couple of years, National Bank initiate credit register, which is government authority. This is a recommendation of the IMF. And an interesting your point of view, correspondence between these private bureaus and state authority credit register, because when we have this as a state authority, this may be some interesting situation when the government authority or central bank authority organize some type of the credit bureaus, but this is government. Thank you.
So the idea is that credit bureaus usually perform slightly more advanced function, right? So for instance, they will provide a credit score in which they will analyze more data than the credit registry will do, right? So they actually will come out with a credit rating that the lender can simply use. My view is that I would prefer to allow the lender itself, just by looking at past repayment information, to come up with a credit rating themselves, right? So in the case of Bosnia, there is a credit bureau, and the credit bureau will give you a score for each borrower, right? And it won't really tell you how the score is computed. Of course, this is easier for the loan officer, right? Because they can simply compare different scores. The credit registry, whenever you pull data from this credit registry in Bosnia, simply tells you this was the loan that they took in 2008. They didn't repay the fourth rate of the loan, and they repaid it back after 3 months. Right? There's no score, no grade given, and then it's more work, of course, for the loan officer. But the information is much more transparent, in my view, and it's easier to administer. Right? So this way. Yeah, hopefully that's the question.
Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, let me conclude the session and thank again all of our presenters, and let's have a coffee.